When they performed the autopsy on King Charles II of Spain in 1700, the royal physicians stood in stunned silence. What they found inside the body of the most powerful monarch in Europe made them physically recoil. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. They wrote that down. Actually wrote that. The king's heart had shriveled to almost nothing. His intestines were rotting, gangrenous, black. His lungs looked like they'd been corroded by acid. And then they found something that explained why the Spanish Habsburg dynasty was about to go extinct. Charles had one testicle, just one, and it was black as coal, dead tissue. This was the King of Spain, ruler of an empire so vast the sun never set on his territories. Master of the Americas, the Philippines, territories across Europe. And his body was so destroyed, so genetically catastrophic, that modern scientists who studied his family tree couldn't believe what they found. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was 0.254. Let me put that in perspective. That number is higher than if his parents had been brother and sister. His parents were actually uncle and niece. But because the Habsburg family had been marrying cousins to cousins and uncles to nieces for 200 years, Charles's genetics were worse than direct sibling incest. He was the most inbred human being ever measured by science. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how it happened, how a dynasty deliberately destroyed itself, how they produced a king who couldn't walk until age 8, who couldn't close his mouth, whose tongue was so large it prevented him from speaking clearly, whose body was so broken that 2 of his wives couldn't get pregnant no matter how hard they tried, because Charles II was sterile, deformed, the walking embodiment of genetic catastrophe. And when he died at 38 years old, his death without an heir triggered a war that killed 400,000 people. This is what happens when you keep it in the family for too long. This is what 200 years of strategic marriages produced, and the Habsburgs did it to themselves. I'm going to show you exactly how the Habsburg family destroyed themselves, how they married uncles to nieces, cousins to cousins for 16 generations, how they produced 34 children between 1527 and 1661, and half of them died before age 10, how Charles II suffered from at least 2 rare genetic disorders simultaneously, disorders so unlikely to occur together that the only explanation is centuries of accumulated inbreeding, how his autopsy revealed a body so malformed that the doctors were horrified, and how his death without an heir plunged Europe into a war that killed 400,000 people. Because the Habsburg family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a wreath, a circle, folding back on itself again and again until it strangled the dynasty to death. And Charles II, poor Charles, was where it all came to an end. If you've never heard the true extent of royal inbreeding before, hit that like button right now, because I've got 5 shocking revelations coming up about how the Habsburg jaw became a symbol of genetic catastrophe. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll understand why keeping it in the family was the worst decision any royal dynasty ever made. Picture this. The year is 1477. Maximilian I of Austria marries Mary of Burgundy. It's a political masterstroke, uniting the Habsburg lands in Austria with the rich territories of Burgundy and the Netherlands. The marriage produces 2 children, Philip and Margaret. And here's where the Habsburg family motto really kicks in. Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry. The Habsburgs didn't conquer territory through warfare. They married into it. Strategic marriages, careful alliances, connecting themselves to every major royal house in Europe. And at first, it worked brilliantly. Philip, Maximilian's son, married Joanna of Castile. You might know her as Joanna the Mad, the queen we talked about in a previous video, the one who was locked away for 46 years. Philip and Joanna had 6 children. One of them was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, ruler of an empire so vast that the sun never set on Habsburg lands. This was the peak of Habsburg power, the apex of what strategic marriage could achieve. But there was a problem the Habsburgs didn't see coming, or maybe they did see it and didn't care. Because in their quest to keep power within the family, they'd started marrying relatives. Not distant relatives, close relatives. Charles V married his cousin Isabella of Portugal. Their son, Philip II, married 4 times. His third wife? His niece. Elizabeth of Valois was his third wife, not his niece, but his fourth wife. Anna of Austria was his niece, the daughter of his sister Maria and Maximilian II. Philip II and Anna of Austria had several children. Their son, Philip III, became king, and Philip III married his cousin Margaret of Austria. Their son was Philip IV. And here's where the genetic nightmare really accelerates, because Philip IV married twice. His first wife was Elizabeth of France. She was his cousin. They had multiple children, but only one daughter survived to adulthood. After Elizabeth died, Philip IV needed a son, a male heir to inherit the Spanish Empire. So he married again. And who did he marry? His niece, Mariana of Austria. Mariana was Philip's brother's daughter. She was 30 years younger than Philip. She'd originally been engaged to Philip's son from his first marriage. But the son died, so Philip just married her himself, his own niece, his brother's daughter, a girl young enough to be his granddaughter. And here's the truly disturbing part. This wasn't even unusual anymore. This was just how the Habsburgs did things now. Mariana wasn't horrified. Her family wasn't shocked. The Pope gave his blessing. Because by the mid-1600s, the Habsburg family had been intermarrying for so long that uncle-niece marriages were considered normal, standard procedure, just another political alliance. Except Mariana and Philip were more closely related than uncle and niece, because Mariana's mother, also named Maria, was Philip's sister, and Maria had married Maximilian. But Maximilian was also Philip's cousin, and Maximilian's mother was Philip's aunt. The family connections had become so tangled that trying to map them makes your brain hurt. Multiple lines of descent connecting the same people over and over. Philip and Mariana weren't just uncle and niece. They were related through at least 3 other paths. Their children would inherit the same genes from multiple ancestors. Over and over, the same genetic information, duplicated, reinforced, concentrated. This is called ancestral inbreeding. And by the time Philip and Mariana had children, the Habsburg family had been doing this for 16 generations. On September 17, 1665, Philip IV died. His only surviving son from his marriage to Mariana was 4 years old, little Charles, the boy who couldn't walk, couldn't speak, could barely eat. This broken child inherited the Spanish Empire, the largest territorial possession in human history, and everyone who saw him knew that the Habsburgs had destroyed themselves, that the price of keeping power in the family was sitting on the throne, unable to chew food, unable to form sentences, unable to walk across a room without falling. This is what 200 years of strategic marriage had produced. Now let's talk about what was actually wrong with Charles II. Because his disabilities weren't just bad luck. They weren't random mutations or unfortunate accidents. They were the predictable, inevitable result of concentrated inbreeding. Modern geneticists have studied Charles's family tree extensively. They've calculated something called an inbreeding coefficient for every member of the Habsburg dynasty. This coefficient, represented by the letter F, measures the probability that someone has inherited 2 identical copies of the same gene from the same ancestor. For most people, this number is 0. Your parents aren't related. so you inherit different versions of genes from each side. For children of first cousins, the inbreeding coefficient is 0.0625, about 6%, higher than 0, but not catastrophically high. For children born to brothers and sisters, the coefficient is 0.25, 25%. A quarter of their genes are identical copies from the same grandparent. This level of inbreeding causes serious problems: birth defects, developmental disabilities, increased risk of genetic diseases. Now guess what Charles II's inbreeding coefficient was? 25.4%, higher than a child born to siblings. Think about that. Charles's parents were uncle and niece, but his inbreeding coefficient was higher than it would have been if they'd been brother and sister. How is that possible? Because of ancestral inbreeding, because the Habsburgs had been marrying relatives for 16 generations. Every Habsburg was related to every other Habsburg through dozens of different paths. Charles didn't just inherit genes from his parents, he inherited the same genes over and over from shared ancestors going back centuries. He was more inbred than anyone alive at the time, possibly more inbred than any human being who'd ever existed. And the physical results were catastrophic. Let's start with the Habsburg jaw, officially called mandibular prognathism. This is when the lower jaw grows too large and protrudes forward, creating an underbite, making it difficult to chew or speak. The Habsburg jaw had been appearing in the family for generations. You can see it in portraits. Charles V had it. Philip II had it. Philip III had a pronounced case. Philip IV had it severely. But Charles II? Charles's jaw was so deformed that he literally couldn't close his mouth. His lower teeth sat several inches in front of his upper teeth. There was no way to bring them together. Food would fall out of his mouth when he tried to eat. He had to swallow everything whole because he couldn't chew. Foreign ambassadors who met Charles described his eating habits as disturbing. Watching him try to consume food was grotesque. He'd shove it in his mouth, try to swallow, choke, gag, sometimes vomit. His tongue was enormous, too large for his mouth. It contributed to his speech difficulties. When Charles tried to talk, his words were slurred, garbled, almost incomprehensible. People who didn't know him well couldn't understand what he was saying, and even those who spent time with him had to concentrate hard to make out his meaning. One diplomat wrote that Charles's tongue was locked, or trabado in Spanish, unable to move properly, creating a fumbling, stuttering speech pattern that made conversation almost impossible. But the jaw and tongue were just the most visible problems. Charles suffered from rickets as a child. This is a bone disease caused by vitamin D deficiency. But Charles wasn't malnourished. He was a king. He had access to the best food in Europe. So why did he have rickets? Modern medical analysis suggests Charles suffered from combined pituitary hormone deficiency, a rare genetic disorder that affects growth. The pituitary gland doesn't produce enough growth hormone, leading to stunted development, weak bones, and multiple other symptoms. This would explain why Charles couldn't walk until he was 8 years old, why his bones were so soft and malformed, why he needed leg braces until he was 5, why he remained short and frail his entire life. He also likely suffered from distal renal tubular acidosis, another rare genetic disorder affecting the kidneys. This causes problems with acid balance in the blood, leading to kidney stones, bone disease, growth retardation, and other symptoms. The odds of someone having both of these disorders at the same time, astronomically low. These are rare diseases. Most people never encounter anyone with either condition. But having both, that's almost unheard of. Unless you're Charles II of Spain, because both disorders are recessive, meaning you need to inherit the defective gene from both parents. In a normal population, the chances of both parents carrying rare recessive genes for two different disorders are effectively zero. But in a heavily inbred family, where the same genes appear over and over through multiple ancestors, suddenly those rare recessives aren't rare anymore. They're concentrated, reinforced, expressed. Charles's inbreeding practically guaranteed he'd inherit rare genetic disorders that his ancestors had been carrying for generations. Quick favor, if this is revealing information you've never learned before, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because I'm doing an entire series on how royal dynasties destroyed themselves through inbreeding, and what's coming up next about Charles's autopsy will make everything we've discussed so far look tame by comparison. But first, we need to talk about Charles's childhood, because understanding what his early years were like helps explain why his eventual death without an heir was such a foregone conclusion. Charles was born on November 6, 1661. His birth was celebrated throughout Spain. Finally, Philip IV had a male heir. The Spanish Empire would continue. The Habsburg dynasty was secure. Except within hours of the birth, people started noticing problems. The baby was big-headed, according to contemporary accounts. His skull was misshapen, enlarged. At 3 years old, the bones still hadn't fused properly. You could feel the soft fontanelles, those gaps where the skull bones should have grown together. They remained open, pulsing, creating a disturbing impression that the baby's brain was exposed just beneath a thin layer of skin. He was also described as a weak, breastfed baby. He couldn't nurse properly, couldn't get a strong suck going because of his jaw deformity and oversized tongue. The wet nurses struggled to feed him. He'd choke, spit up, fail to gain weight. For the first few years of his life, everyone expected Charles to die. Any day, any moment. He'd stop breathing, develop a fever, catch an infection. Royal babies died all the time, and Charles was so obviously sick that betting on his survival seemed foolish. But somehow, he lived. He survived measles, chickenpox, rubella, smallpox, any one of which could have killed him, any one of which killed healthier children every day. Charles kept breathing, kept living, kept defying expectations. Though calling what he did living might be generous. At 4 years old, Charles couldn't walk. His legs were twisted, bowed, too weak to support even his small body weight. They put him in leg braces, metal contraptions that held his legs in a more normal position, trying to force the bones to grow straight. He hated them, cried when they were put on, but he wore them anyway, until he was 5. And gradually, slowly, his legs got stronger. He took his first steps around age 8, later than any normal child. But for Charles, it was a victory. His speech development was equally delayed. He didn't say his first words until age 4, and even then, his vocabulary was limited. The oversized tongue, the deformed jaw, the possible developmental delays from his genetic disorders. All of it made learning to speak nearly impossible. His tutors worked with him for years, teaching him Castilian Spanish, trying to help him form words clearly, attempting to expand his ability to communicate. Some progress was made. By his teenage years, Charles could carry on conversations, could make his wishes known, could participate in court life. But he never spoke easily, never clearly. His speech always retained that slurred, garbled quality that made understanding him difficult. Foreign diplomats meeting Charles for the first time were often shocked. They'd heard he had health problems. But seeing him in person was something else entirely. The jaw that couldn't close, the tongue too large for his mouth, the slurred, barely comprehensible speech, the difficulty eating, the frail body. One envoy from France wrote that Charles was so ugly as to cause fear. Another described him as looking ill, fevered, close to death. These weren't exaggerations. these were accurate descriptions of what 2 centuries of inbreeding had produced. A king who looked like a monster, not through any fault of his own, but because his ancestors had prioritized power over genetics, had chosen strategic marriages over genetic diversity, had condemned their descendants to suffer for their ambition. When Charles's father died in 1665, the 4-year-old became King Charles II of Spain. Obviously, he couldn't actually rule. He could barely walk, could barely talk. So his mother, Mariana of Austria, became Queen Regent. She would govern Spain in her son's name until he came of age, which should have been at 14. Except when Charles turned 14, Mariana looked at her son and made the obvious calculation. This boy couldn't rule. He wasn't capable. His health was too fragile, his mind too weak, his body too broken. So Mariana kept power, kept ruling as regent even though Charles was technically old enough to take the throne. Charles, to his credit, protested. He insisted he was capable, that he should be allowed to govern, that his mother needed to step aside. Eventually in 1675, Mariana relented. Charles was officially declared fit to rule, and Spain entered a period of chaotic, ineffective governance that would define the rest of his reign, because Charles wasn't fit to rule. His mother had been right about that, but she'd made him anyway. 2 centuries of Habsburg marriage strategy had produced a king with the body and mind of a damaged child, and that king was now responsible for an empire spanning 4 continents. But Charles tried. He genuinely tried to be a good king. He attended council meetings, listened to his advisors, made decisions when he could. The problem was that power-hungry nobles and courtiers quickly realized that Charles was easy to manipulate. He was isolated, lonely, desperate for affection and guidance. He trusted people who didn't deserve trust, relied on advisors who used him for their own ends. The Spanish court became a snake pit, different factions fighting for control, everyone trying to influence the king, to get their preferred policies implemented, to gain wealth and power by proximity to the throne. And Charles, poor Charles, was stuck in the middle, barely understanding the games being played around him, making decisions based on whoever had his ear that week. Spain declined rapidly during Charles's reign. The empire that had dominated Europe for a century started losing territory, losing wars, losing prestige. Part of this was inevitable. Spain had been overstretched for decades, but Charles's incompetent leadership accelerated the decay. By the 1680s, foreign observers were openly wondering how much longer the Spanish Empire could survive. One wrote that, "It is incomprehensible how this monarchy survives." But the question that obsessed everyone, the question that dominated European politics for decades, wasn't whether Spain would survive. It was, who would inherit when Charles died? Because everyone knew Charles was going to die without children. At 18 years old, Charles married for the first time. His bride was Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess, daughter of Philippe, Duke of Orléans, and granddaughter of Louis XIII. She was beautiful, young, healthy, and completely horrified when she met her husband. Marie-Louise had heard that Charles had health problems, but nothing prepared her for the reality of the man she'd married. The protruding jaw, the oversized tongue, the difficulty speaking and eating, the frail, weak body, the peculiar smell, because Charles's various medical conditions gave him a distinctive odor, one that perfumes and incense couldn't quite mask. Marie-Louise reportedly spent her first weeks in Spain crying, just crying, locked in her rooms, refusing to come out. She'd been forced into this marriage for political reasons, and now she was stuck with a husband who repulsed her. But Marie-Louise was a princess. She'd been trained since birth to do her duty. so she tried. She shared Charles's bed. She went through the motions of being his wife. She even pretended publicly to care for him. For 10 years, Marie-Louise lived as Queen of Spain. For 10 years, she tried to conceive. And for 10 years, nothing happened. No pregnancy, no children, no heir. Court physicians examined her, found nothing wrong, so the problem had to be with Charles. In 1689, Marie-Louise died suddenly. The official cause was appendicitis, though some suspected poison. After her death, rumours spread. Rumours that Marie-Louise had confided in friends about Charles's abilities, or lack thereof. She'd reportedly told people that Charles suffered from premature ejaculation, that he couldn't maintain an erection, that their attempts at intercourse were humiliating failures, that producing an heir was physically impossible. The rumours were probably true. Charles's inbreeding, his genetic disorders, his malformed body, all of it pointed toward infertility. But Spain needed an heir. So 6 months after Marie-Louise's death, Charles married again. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess, from a family known for its fertility. If anyone could give Charles a child, surely Maria Anna could. She was healthy, young, from good genetic stock. Except genetic stock doesn't matter when your husband is infertile. Maria Anna and Charles tried for 11 years. 11 years of attempting to conceive. 11 years of failure. No pregnancies, no miscarriages, no signs that conception was even possible. By the late 1690s, everyone had accepted the truth. Charles II would die without an heir. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty was ending, and Europe started preparing for war. Because who would inherit Spain? Charles had no children, no siblings, no close relatives except those who already ruled other countries. The two main candidates were Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, and Archduke Charles of Austria. Both had legitimate claims through female Habsburg ancestors. Both wanted Spain desperately, and both had powerful backers willing to fight for their candidate. Charles knew this, knew that his death would trigger a war, knew that his inability to produce an heir was dooming Spain to conflict, and there was nothing he could do about it. His body wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't function, wouldn't give Spain the heir it desperately needed. As Charles entered his 30s, his health deteriorated further. He'd been sickly his entire life. But now things got worse. He started having seizures, epileptic fits that would strike without warning. He'd collapse, convulse, foam at the mouth. Court physicians had no idea how to help him. They tried bloodletting, purgatives, prayer, exorcism, because by this point, many people believed Charles was cursed, bewitched, that evil spirits or black magic were responsible for his condition. The nickname El Hechizado became common, the bewitched. They performed exorcisms on him multiple times. Priests would pray over Charles while he convulsed, sprinkling holy water, commanding demons to leave his body, trying to cure what they thought was supernatural possession. Of course, Charles wasn't possessed. He was suffering from the medical consequences of severe inbreeding. But nobody understood genetics, yet. Nobody knew what they'd done to him. At age 35, Charles started going bald. All his hair fell out, every last strand. He looked, according to witnesses, elderly, decrepit, like a man in his 70s, not his 30s. His teeth, what few he had left, began falling out. His digestion, always poor, got worse. He suffered from constant diarrhea, stomach pains, difficulty eating anything without vomiting. He had hallucinations, saw things that weren't there, heard voices. Sometimes he talked to people who'd been dead for years. His mental state, never strong, was crumbling, and everyone knew that Charles didn't have much longer. Foreign ambassadors sent reports home. detailing Charles's decline, describing his deteriorating condition, estimating how much longer he might survive. Everyone was waiting for Charles to die, so the real business of dividing Spain could begin. On September 28, 1700, Charles became too ill to eat. For 3 years he'd been declining, but now the end was approaching. He couldn't keep food down, couldn't drink water without vomiting. His body, already weak, was shutting down. Physicians attended him constantly, trying everything they knew, bleeding him, purging him, praying. Nothing worked. Charles knew he was dying, and he knew he needed to name an heir. The decision he'd been avoiding for decades, the choice that would determine Spain's future. Under pressure from his advisors, particularly the Archbishop of Toledo, Charles finally made his decision. He named Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, as his heir, the French candidate. Spain would go to France, the Habsburg dynasty would end, and the Bourbon dynasty would begin. Charles signed his will on October 2nd, 1700. 1 month later, on November 1st, 1700, King Charles II of Spain died. He was 38 years old, just days shy of his 39th birthday. And when physicians performed an autopsy, what they found inside Charles's body horrified them, even by the standards of experienced royal physicians. The autopsy report has survived, and it's devastating. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. This suggests severe heart disease, possibly from his genetic disorders, possibly from malnutrition. His heart had literally shriveled. His lungs corroded. Advanced lung disease, probably from the respiratory infections that had plagued him since childhood. His intestines rotten and gangrenous. His digestive system, which had never worked properly, was decomposed, necrotic, dead tissue still inside his living body. He had a single testicle, black as coal. This explains his infertility. Charles was born with only one testicle, and that one was diseased, possibly cancerous, definitely non-functional. No wonder he couldn't father children. And his head was full of water, hydrocephalus, fluid accumulation in the brain. This probably came from childhood measles, which Charles had survived. But the infection had caused permanent brain damage, fluid building up in his skull, pressing on his brain tissue, contributing to his seizures, his cognitive difficulties, his deteriorating mental state. This was what the Habsburg dynasty had created. A king whose body was so malformed, so damaged, so completely destroyed by genetics that even his physicians were shocked. Charles had lived 38 years. 38 years of suffering, of pain, of humiliation, of knowing that his body didn't work, that he was a disappointment, that his inability to produce an heir was destroying his family's dynasty. And on November 16th, 1700, Philip of Anjou was proclaimed King Philip V of Spain. The French Bourbon had won. The Spanish Habsburgs were extinct, but not everyone accepted this outcome. The Austrians declared their own candidate, Archduke Charles, the rightful king. England and the Dutch Republic backed Austria, fearing French dominance of Europe. And on July 9th, 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession began. It would last 13 years. It would involve every major European power. Fighting would occur in Spain, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and at sea. Estimated casualties, 400,000 dead, hundreds of thousands more wounded or displaced. Economic devastation across the continent. All because Charles II died without an heir. All because the Habsburg dynasty had spent 200 years marrying uncles to nieces and cousins to cousins. All because they thought keeping power in the family would keep them strong. Modern geneticists can track exactly how the inbreeding affected the Habsburg family. Between 1527 and 1661, the Spanish Habsburg royal families had 34 children. 10 of them, nearly 30%, died before their first birthday. 17 of them, half, died before they turned 10. For comparison, infant mortality among Spanish villagers during the same period was around 20%. The richest, most powerful family in Spain had worse survival rates than peasants. Why? Inbreeding. Each generation, the inbreeding coefficient went up. Each generation, more babies were born with genetic disorders, more children died young, more survivors suffered from disabilities. The family was cannibalizing itself genetically, using up its genetic diversity. Until finally, in Charles II, there was nothing left. Just a broken body, a dying dynasty, the end of the line, and the Habsburg jaw, that distinctive facial deformity, became a symbol, not of power as the family had hoped, not of pure bloodlines and superior breeding, but of genetic catastrophe, of what happens when you prioritize politics over biology, when you sacrifice genetics for power, when you forget that humans aren't thoroughbred horses that can be selectively bred for desirable traits. Because inbreeding doesn't just preserve good genes, it concentrates all genes, good and bad, especially bad. Recessive genetic disorders that would normally remain hidden get expressed. Birth defects become common, disabilities accumulate, and eventually you get Charles II, unable to walk until age 8, unable to speak clearly, unable to eat without choking, unable to produce an heir, unable to truly rule, just able to survive, to keep breathing for 38 miserable years until his destroyed body finally gave out. So what's the lesson here? Because this isn't just ancient history. This is a demonstration of genetics in action, of what happens when populations become too isolated, too inbred. The Habsburg dynasty thought they were being clever. Strategic marriages to maintain power, keep wealth in the family, ensure loyalty. And for a while, it worked. For a couple of generations, the strategy was successful. But genetics doesn't care about political strategy. Genetics operates by different rules, rules that the Habsburgs either didn't understand or chose to ignore. And by the time they realized what they'd done, it was too late. The damage was irreversible. Charles II was born damaged, would always be damaged, would die damaged, taking the Spanish Habsburg dynasty down with him. The empire his ancestors had built through strategic marriages would be destroyed by those same strategic marriages. The irony is perfect. The Habsburgs destroyed themselves doing exactly what they thought would save them. Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry. They should have added a second line. But don't marry your niece, or your cousin, or anyone you're already related to through 3 different paths. Because if you do, 200 years from now, you'll produce a king whose heart is the size of a peppercorn and whose dynasty dies with him. The Spanish Habsburgs are gone. The Austrian branch lasted longer, but eventually died out too. The family that had dominated European politics for centuries was destroyed by its own marriage strategy. And Charles II, the bewitched, the last king of the Spanish Habsburg line, stands as a warning. A reminder of what happens when biology is ignored in favor of politics, when genetic diversity is sacrificed for strategic alliances, when keeping it in the family goes on for too long. His portraits still hang in museums across Spain, showing that impossible jaw, that distinctive Habsburg face, the physical manifestation of 200 years of inbreeding. Looking at those portraits, knowing what we know now about Charles's life, about his suffering, about his broken body and damaged genetics, it's hard not to feel pity. He didn't choose to be born this way, didn't choose the ancestors whose genes created him, didn't choose the family strategy that destroyed him before he even existed. He was just the inevitable endpoint of a genetic disaster, the last tragic chapter in a 200-year mistake. And when he died on November 1st, 1700, childless and broken, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty died with him, proving once and for all that you can't keep power in the family forever. Eventually, biology catches up, and the price is always higher than anyone imagined. If this investigation into the genetic disaster of the Habsburg dynasty shocked you, you need to see a future video where I expose the Egyptian royal family who took inbreeding even further than the Habsburgs. Brother-sister marriages for generations, producing pharaohs so deformed they couldn't walk. Discover what happened when a dynasty took inbreeding to its ultimate extreme. Make sure you're subscribed, because I'm uncovering the suppressed genetic horrors of royal dynasties that historians try to romanticize. These kings and queens deserve to have their true stories told, not the sanitized fairy tale version, but the real, genetic, scientifically verified truth about what inbreeding did to them. Drop a comment telling me which part of Charles II's story shocked you the most. Was it the peppercorn heart, the single black testicle, the high inbreeding coefficient? Because this isn't just history, this is genetics, this is biology. This is what happens when humans forget that they're subject to the same natural laws as every other species.